When I first met Elliot, I was just a young author like another, and he took no notice of me. He never forgot a face, and when I ran across him here or there, he shook hands with me cordially, but showed no desire to further our acquaintance. And if I saw him at the opera, say, he being with a person of high rank, he was apt not to catch sight of me. But then, when I happened to make a somewhat startling success as a playwright, and presently I became aware that Elliot regarded me with a warmer feeling. One day I received a note from him asking me to lunch at Claridge's, where he lived when in London. It was a small party and not a very smart one, and I conceived the notion that he was trying me out. But from then on, since my success had brought me many new friends, I began to see him more frequently. Shortly after this, I spent some weeks of the autumn in Paris and met him at the house of a common acquaintance. He asked me where I was staying, and in a day or two I received another invitation to lunch, this time at his apartment. When I arrived, I was surprised to see that it was a party of considerable distinction. I giggled to myself. I knew that with his perfect sense of social relations, he had realized that in English society as an author I was not of much account, but that in France, where an author just because he is an author has prestige, I was. During the years that followed, our acquaintance became fairly intimate without ever developing into friendship. I doubt whether it was possible for Elliot Templeton to be a friend. He took no interest in people apart from their social position. When I chanced to be in Paris or he in London, he continued to ask me to parties when he wanted an extra man or was obliged to entertain traveling Americans. Some of these were, I suspected, old clients, and some were strangers sent to him with letters of introduction. They were the cross of his life. He felt he had to do something for them, and yet was unwilling to have them meet his grand friends. The best way of disposing of them, of course, was to give them dinner and take them to a play, but that was often difficult when he was engaged every evening for 3 weeks ahead, and also he had an inkling that they would scarcely be satisfied with that. Since I was an author and so of little consequence, he didn't mind telling me his troubles on this matter. People in America are so inconsiderate in the way they give letters. It's not that I'm not delighted to see the people who are sent to me, but I really don't see why I should inflict them on my friends. He sought to make amends by sending them great baskets of roses and huge boxes of chocolates, but sometimes he had to do more. It was then, somewhat naively, after what he had told me, that he asked me to come to the party he was organizing. "They want to meet you so much," he wrote to flatter me. "Miss So-and-so is a very cultivated woman, and she's read every word you've written. Miss So-and-so would then tell me she'd so much enjoyed my book, Mr. Perrin and Mr. Trail, and congratulate me on my play, The Mollusk. The first of these was written by Hugh Walpole and the second by Hubert Henley Davis. I have given the reader an impression that Elliot Templeton was a despicable character. I have done him an injustice. He was, for one thing, what the French call serviceable, a word for which, so far as I know, there is no exact equivalent in English. The dictionary tells me that serviceable, in the sense of helpful, obliging, and kind, is archaic. That is just what Elliot was. He was generous, and though early in his career he had doubtless showered flowers, candy, and presents on his acquaintance from an alterative motive, he continued to do so when he was no longer necessary. It caused him pleasure to give. He was hospitable. His chef was as good as any in Paris, and you could be sure at his table of having set before you the earliest delicacies of the season. His wine proved the excellence of his judgment. It is true that his guests were chosen for their social importance rather than because they were good company. But he took care to invite at least one or two for their powers of entertainment, so that his parties were almost always amusing. People laughed at him behind his back and called him a filthy snob, but nevertheless accepted his invitations with alacrity. His French was fluent and correct, and his accent perfect. He had taken great pains to adopt the manner of speech as it is spoken in England, and you had to have a very sensitive ear to catch now and then an American intonation. He was a good talker if only you could keep him off the subject of dukes and duchesses, but even about them, now that his position was unassailable, he allowed himself, especially when you were alone with him, to be amusing. He had a pleasantly malicious tongue, and there was no scandal about these exalted personages that did not reach his ears. From him I learned who was the father of the Princess X's last child, and who was the mistress of Marquis de Y. I don't believe even Marcel Proust knew more of the inner life of the aristocracy than Elliot Templeton. When I was in Paris, we used often to lunch together, sometimes at his apartment and sometimes at a restaurant. I liked to wander about the antiquity shops occasionally to buy, but more often to look, and Elliot was always enchanted to go with me. He had knowledge and real love of beautiful objects. I think he knew every shop of the kind in Paris and was on familiar terms with the proprietor. He adored haggling, and when we started out would say to me, "If there's anything you want, don't try to buy it yourself. Just give me a hint and let me do the rest." He would be delighted when he had got for me something I fancied for half the asking price. It was a real treat to watch him bargain. He would argue, cajole, lose his temper, appeal to the seller's better nature, ridicule him, point out the defects of the object in question, threaten never to cross his threshold again, sigh, shrug his shoulders, admonish, start for the door in frowning anger, When finally he had won his point, shake his head sadly as though he accepted defeat with resignation. Then he would whisper to me in English, "Take it with you. It would be cheap at double the money." Elliot was zealous Catholic. He had not lived long in Paris before he met an abbé who was celebrated for his success in bringing infidels and heretics back to the fold. He was a great diner out and a noted wit. He confined his ministrations to the rich and the aristocratic. It was inevitable that Elliot should be attracted by a man who, though of humble origins, was a welcome guest in the most exclusive houses, and he confided to a wealthy American lady who was one of the Abbey's recent converts that, though his family had always been Episcopalian, he had for long been interested in the Catholic Church. She asked Elliot to meet the Abbey at dinner one evening, just 3 of them, and the Abbey was scintillating. Elliot's hostess brought the conversation around to Catholicism, and the Abbey spoke of it with unction, but without pedantry. As a man of word, though a priest speaking to a man of the world, Elliot was flattered to discover that the Abbey knew all about him. "The Duchess of Vendôme was speaking of you the other day. She told me that she thought you highly intelligent." Elliot flushed with pleasure. He had been presented to Her Royal Highness, but it had never occurred to him that she would give him a second thought. The Abbey spoke of the faith with wisdom and benignity. He was broad-minded, modern in his outlook, and tolerant. He made the church seem, to Elliot, like a very select club that a well-bred man owed it to himself to belong to. 6 months later, he was received into it. His conversation, combined with the generosity he showed in his contributions to Catholic charities, opened several doors that had been closed to him before. It may be that his motives in abandoning the faith of his fathers were mixed, but there could be no doubt of his devoutness when he had done so. He attended Mass every Sunday at the church frequented by the best people, went to confession regularly, and made periodical visits to Rome. In course of time, he was rewarded for his piety by being made a papal chamberlain, and the assiduity with which he performed the duties of his office were rewarded by the order of, I think, the Holy Sepulchre. His career as a Catholic was in fact no less successful than his career as a homme du monde. I often asked myself, what was the cause of the snobbishness that obsessed this man who was so intelligent, so kindly, and so cultivated? He was no upstart. His father had been president of one of the southern universities, and his grandfather a divine of some immense. Elliot was too clever not to see that many of the persons who accepted his invitations did so only to get a free meal, and that of these were stupid and some worthless. The glamour of their resounding titles blinded him to their faults. I can only guess that to be on terms of intimate familiarity with these gentlemen of ancient lineage, to be the faithful retainer of their ladies gave him a sensation of triumph that never palled, and I think that at the back of it all was passionate romanticism that led him to see the weedy little French Duke, the Crusader, who had gone to the Holy Land with St. Louis, and in blustering fox-hunting English Earl, the ancestor who had attended Henry VIII to the field of the cloth of gold. In the company of such as these he felt that he lived in a spacious and gallant past. I think when he turned the pages of the Almanach de Gotha, his heart beat warmly as one name after another brought him back to him recollections of old wars, historic sieges, and celebrated duels, diplomatic intrigues, and the love affairs of kings. Such, anyhow, was Elliot Templeton.